Hey everyone, it's been a while since I've done a book review, so today I'm going to be reviewing High Output Management by Andy Grove. So Andy Grove was the CEO of Intel he became CEO in 1987, and he was an immigrant from Hungary, and he is a very good teacher. He's a very good communicator. He's a very clear thinker, and I learned about this book through my ex-boss, who I admire very much, and he is also a very good thinker. So it's one of those things where, if someone who's good at a thing reads a book by someone else who is supposedly good at the thing, and you can learn from them directly, why not, right? So I got it, I read it, and I enjoyed it very much. And I won't say that I have internalized everything that Andy has to teach, but I think that I have gotten a few good ideas out of it, and I think even more importantly, I appreciate his way of thinking, or his way of being, his approach to solving problems. For example, one of Andy's ideas, which is so simple if you think about it, is that if you're not doing something, there's only two reasons why. You're not doing it because you don't want to do it, or you're not doing it because you can't do it. Either you're unwilling or you're unable, or both, right? It's just those two variables. And so if you are trying to do something, if you say that you want to do something, let's say you want to run a marathon, right? Is it that you don't want to, or you don't, or you can't? And then you got to break it, and most probably you can't, because you don't have the physical ability to literally put one foot in front of the other, the number of tens of thousands of times you got to do to cross 42 kilometers, right? And so then you need to train to get an ability that you don't currently have. You have to train, and now to run your marathon, you have a training program, right? And then the question is, so let's say the training program says, so are you willing and able to set up a training program? And it could be that you don't know how. You want to, but you don't know how, and then you have to find out how. So you might Google it. You might ask someone who knows how to do it. You might look for people who've run marathons before, and then they will have a marathon guide. They'll say, run 3 times a week on every this day, set, track your time, blah, blah, blah. So now that you know how, right, it's a question of, can you do the training, right? And so can you go for a run every third day? And, can you make the attempt? Are you... And eventually you get to the point where the ability is not much of a problem anymore. If it's like couch to 5K or whatever, like the first thing you got to do is just get out of your house and go for a walk. And you can do that, but so if you're not doing it, it's because you don't want to. So why do you not want to? Then you have to address your motivations. You have to address, your thinking about the thing. And, that's not a particularly like grand or complex idea. In fact, it's remarkably simple, but I find that it's such a useful tool, a cognitive tool, an idea to bring to every problem that you have. There's a problem. Do you want to solve it? Can you solve it? It's like that. And I will look up my tweets about this as well, because again, I have a thread, and I might as well high output management. So the book was written in the 80s. It's still relevant. I would say that it's still relevant, and it's because his thinking was so clear. And he updated the book in 1995 to talk about globalization. On competition, we learned that we must lead with our strength. Being second best in a tough environment is just not good enough. Globalization. If the world operates as one big market, every employee will compete with every person everywhere in the world who is capable of doing the same job. There are a lot of them, and many of them are very hungry. On planning. You cannot plan the way a fire department plans. It cannot anticipate where the next fire will be, so it has to shape an energetic and efficient team that is capable of responding to the unanticipated as well as to any ordinary event. On optimism. You cannot be optimistic about the future until you have survived the crucible of change. That's a very powerful sentence. You cannot be optimistic about the future until you have survived the crucible of change. The future is scary to those who have not survived change. Once you know you can survive change, then change becomes exciting, change becomes interesting. From Ben Horowitz's foreword to this book, he says, So, Miss Manager, you know more about our product's viral loop than anyone in the company. That's worth exactly nothing unless you can effectively transfer that knowledge to the rest of the organization. On being friends with the people you manage. Should you be friends with the people you manage? Imagine yourself delivering a tough performance review to your friend. Do you cringe at the thought? If yes, then don't do it because it'll hurt your work. If no, then do it because your friendships will likely strengthen your work relationships. And okay, let's start getting into the book. What I like is that he really respects your time as a reader. Like, I guess, and as a CEO, he must have been a busy guy, and he doesn't want to waste people's time. And I remember he ends the book with kind of like a little bit of homework, but it's so respectfully done. I remember he's like you've invested the price of this book plus 8 hours plus of your time. At the risk of sounding like the author of a diet book, I would ask you to do something specific. I will leave you with a set of assignments. Choose what you like, but choose some and perform them honestly. You have trusted me enough to buy my book and read it. Now let me say a final thing. If you do at least 100 points worth of what you find here, so like 10 plus things, you will be a distinctly better manager for it. And then he says, identify the operations in your work, most like process, assembly, and test production. Conduct work simplification on your most tedious, time-consuming task. Eliminate 30% of the number of steps involved. Classify the task relevant maturity. So he introduces these concepts that are really useful, and you kind of have to learn them to get through it. But it's worth learning them because it makes complex things, like complicated things, or seemingly complicated things, less complicated, right? And I like how in part 1 he starts by describing a breakfast factory, which is very it's very intuitive. It's very like you can imagine, even if you've never run a company or whatever, you can imagine running running a cafe, right? Running your own kitchen, right? A kitchen is an output. And a kitchen has an output and it has a process, right? And I'm still in the introduction. We found that all of our employees produce in some sense. Some make chips, some prepare bills, others create software designs or advertising copy. And so, what should managers be doing when there's a limitless number of possible tasks that call for their attention? And to answer that question, I introduced the concept of managerial leverage, which measures the impact of what managers do to increase the output of their teams. So the first idea of the book is an output orientation approach to management. So it's a kind of a manufacturing point of view. And if you're doing creative work, it's tempting to think that output might not be the correct metric. But so like I'm making these YouTube videos, right? And one of the things I believe is that the more prolific I am, the more videos I make, if I can release 1 or potentially 2 videos a day, right? That will make me a more creative, more interesting, more effective person. And I'm sure that my attitudes on being prolific have been shaped by books like High Output Management, which is, I'm trying to produce high output. What else? All of our employees produce. A team will only perform well if peak performance is elicited from the individuals in it. Task relevant feedback. So don't waste people's time with feedback that isn't relevant to the level of the task that they're doing. You are in a business with 1 employee, yourself. You're in competition with millions of similar businesses, blah, blah, blah. Nobody owes you a career, that's sad news. Are you adding real value, or are you merely passing information along? How do you add more value? By looking for ways to make things truly better in your department. The output of a manager is the output of his organization. So in principle, every hour of your day should be spent increasing the output or the value of the output of the people whom you're responsible for. It's such a simple idea, right? It's just, if you're a manager, you're managing a bunch of people, their output is your output. And so your job is to increase or improve their output. So if there's anything you can do to make them do better, then you're doing better. Even if you're only a manager of you, right? Like, so I'm making these videos. I am the guy in front of the camera right now is the guy making this video. But there's another guy in my head who is managing this guy, right? Who's deciding what to eat, when to sleep, when to wake up, how to plan. And like, it's like there's that maker and manager at the same time, and the manager's job is to free the maker and empower the maker to do as much as possible, right? How to manage the forward. Let's skip the forward. The basics of production: delivering a breakfast, and the task is, you want to respond to build and deliver products in response to the demands of the customer at a scheduled delivery time, at an acceptable quality level, and at the lowest possible cost, right? Or an acceptable cost, right? And we start by looking at our production flow. And the first thing we'll want to do when we're looking at the flow is to identify what's the limiting step. And this is such a I love reading. I love rereading this. I'm rereading this now. I haven't read it in months, maybe a year. But I enjoy how he has enough experience as a manager to speak with conviction and say the first thing we must do when we look at our production flow is to identify the limiting step. Like, wow, as I'm reading this while I'm making this review, I'm thinking about it again. I'm like, what is the limiting step in my production flow? And he draws this diagram. Let me show you. It's not showing up. There we go. That's the diagram of a breakfast production chart, right? And the eggs. So you see, boiling the eggs is the thing that takes the longest time, and so the eggs are the limiting step, because you can pour the coffee immediately, and it's cute how there's this he uses like this diagram that says, so it says pour coffee and then test, get bread, toast, test, get eggs, boil eggs. And so you have the coffee, you test it, you have the toast, you test it, and then you have the eggs, you test, and you assemble. And that assembling is when you put together everything, right? And so because the eggs take the longest, we should plan the entire job around the time needed to boil it. Not only does the component take the longest time to prepare, it's also for most customers the most important part of the breakfast. The idea of a limiting step has very broad applicability. Take, for example, the need to recruit college graduates to work for Intel. To apply the basic principle of production, you need to build the sequence here around its most expensive feature, which is the student's trip to the plant, thanks to the cost of the travel and the time the managers spend with their candidates. To minimize the use of this step per final college hire, we obviously have to increase the ratio of accepted offers to applicants to visit the plant, which we do by using phone interviews to screen people before issuing the invitations. This technique saves money, substantially increases the ratio of offers extended per plant visit, and reduces the need to use expensive limiting step per hire. That's so good. It's so obvious. It's so there's this essay by one of my Twitter friends, GTK, Jong Moon Kim, and he says that anything that is effective upon implementation becomes obvious. When you put an eraser at the back of a pencil so that you can just flip it and erase, it becomes obvious. But it wasn't always done, and so like a lot of things don't exist until they do exist, and then it becomes obvious that it should have existed all along, right? And similarly, so it's like if you're hiring people by inviting them to come to your office, and then that takes up a bunch of your time, and you're doing that regularly, then it makes sense to figure out how to improve your ratio by doing phone interviews, or just figuring out something. So the thing that takes the longest time, or the most cost, you then want to figure out what takes less time and less cost to reduce the error rate, right? You want to reduce the error rate of your most lengthy process or your most costly process. And the thing is, this is why I want to recommend this book, which is that I've only shared with this like the first 6 pages, right? And the book goes on for 200 plus pages, and it's just, here is a guy who thought really hard and he implemented his practices in his organization, and Intel became really substantial during his tenure, during his leadership, right? And that's because of this very efficient and effective process management, project management. And it's just, when I read it, I get excited. Even now reading it, I feel like I want to stop this video and I want to map out my YouTube video production process. Like, where are the ideas? What's the limiting step? What is the limiting step? The thing that takes the most amount of time is producing the video itself, I guess, right? Well, initially I once tried to do video essays, and then video editing took the most amount of time, and so I didn't want to edit my videos because, I don't want to over polish a turd, right? I don't want to spend time doing that until I feel ready. He talks about the importance of one-on-one meetings so that people are clear about what they understand with each other. He talks about delegation. He maps out an entire day of his life and like what each thing he did was and why he did it. I listened to his reasons. So he met the manager who wanted to resign. I listened to his reasons, felt he could be turned around, nudged, gathering information, more and more. My day always ends when I'm tired and ready to go home, not when I'm done. A manager should move to the point where his leverage would be the greatest. It's just, it's so much wisdom. Devise schedules to serve you. That was to make something regular that was once irregular is a fundamental production principle, and that's how you should try to handle the interruptions that plague you. Impose a pattern on the way you cope with your problems, on how to deal with interruptions. If people who interrupt you knew how much they were disturbing you, they would probably police themselves more closely. Instead of going into hiding, a manager can hang a sign on his door that says, "I'm doing individual work, please don't interrupt me unless it really can't wait until 2 o'clock. Then hold an open office hour and be completely receptive to anybody who wants to see you." Understand that interrupters have legitimate problems that need to be handled. That's why they're bringing them to you. Right? Yeah, it's... You can prepare standard responses for the interruptions that pop up most often. Customers don't come up with totally new questions and problems day in and day out. Because the same ones tend to surface repeatedly, a manager can reduce time spent handling interruptions by using standard responses. Having them available also means that a manager can delegate much of the job to less experienced personnel. Also, use the production principle of batching, that is handling a group of similar chores at one time. Many interruptions can be accumulated and handled non-randomly. Again, all of this is... It's not, mysterious wisdom from like nowhere, but it's not otherworldly wisdom. It's very practical, very, if you do something often enough and you think about what you're doing, these things will kind of start to emerge by themselves. But what I enjoy is how just here's a guy who really had to deal with it at a very high level with very high consequences. And he's sharing it with us in a way that is very generous. I'd like to suggest some mechanical hints for effective one-on-one meetings. First of all, both the supervisor and subordinate should have a copy of the outline, and both should take notes on it, which serve a number of purposes. I take notes in just about all circumstances. Mostly don't even look at them again. I do it to keep my mind from drifting and also to digest the information. I'm forced to categorize the information logically, which helps me absorb it. The act implies a commitment, like a handshake, that something will be done. Yeah. Supervisors should also encourage the discussion of heart-to-heart issues during one-on-ones. Perfect forum for getting at subtle and deep work-related problems affecting a subordinate. Are you dissatisfied? Are you satisfied with your own performance? Do you have some frustration or obstacle gnawing at you? Do you have doubts about where you're going? But you should be wary of the zinger, which is a heart-to-heart issue brought up at an awkward time. More often than not, these come near the end of the meeting. They might tell you something like he's unhappy and has been looking outside for a job and give you only 5 minutes to deal with it. So everything he says is grounded in a lot of experience. By sharing his base of information with me, the two of us develop a congruent attitude, approach, and conclusion, conservatism in our expansion plans. Yeah, man. It's just... Even scanning this book, so it's a book that I love to have on my shelf. Trying to look for more underlines. And I remember that towards the end, he talks about training other people. So training is the boss's job. Why training is the boss's job? Recently, my wife and I went out to dinner. The woman who took reservations over the phone seemed flustered, then volunteered that she was new and didn't know all the ropes. No matter, we were booked. We showed up for dinner. We learned that the restaurant had lost its liquor license and that its patrons were expected to bring their own wine if they wanted any. As the maitre d', that how you pronounce it? Maitre D rubbed his hands. He asked, "Weren't you told this on the phone?" And we went through our dinner without wine. I listened to him go through the same routine with every party he seated. I don't know for sure, but it's probably fair to assume that nobody instructed the woman taking calls to tell potential guests what the situation was. Instead, the maitre d' had to go through an inept apology time and time again, and nobody had wine, all because one employee was not properly trained. The consequences of an employee being insufficiently trained can be much more serious. In an instance at Intel, one of our sophisticated pieces of production machinery in a silicon fabrication plant drifted slightly out of tune. The machine operator was relatively new, had been trained in the basics but hadn't been taught to recognize the signs of an out-of-tune operation, continued to operate the machine, subjecting nearly a day's worth of almost completely processed silicon wafers to the wrong machine conditions. By the time the situation was discovered, materials worth more than $1 million had passed through the machine and had to be scrapped. Because it takes 2 weeks to make up such a loss with fresh material, deliveries to our customers slipped, compounding the problem. Situations like these occur all too frequently in business life. Insufficiently trained employees, in spite of their best intentions, produce inefficiencies, excess costs, unhappy customers, and sometimes even dangerous situations. The importance of training rapidly becomes obvious to the manager who runs into these problems. For the already overscheduled manager, the trickier issue may be who should do the training. Most managers seem to feel that training employees is a job that should be left to others, perhaps to training specialists. I, on the other hand, strongly believe that the manager should do it himself. And let me explain why. There's 2 ways to increase the individual performance of subordinates: increasing their motivation, their desire to do the job well, and by increasing capacity, which is where training comes in. If your training efforts result in a 1% improvement in your subordinate's performance, your company will gain the equivalent of 200 hours of work as a result of the expenditure of your 12 hours of training. He goes into more detail about the specifics, but employees should be able to count on something systematic and scheduled, not a rescue effort summoned to solve the problem of the moment. In other words, training should be a process, not an event. Training must be done by a person who represents a suitable role model. We have a university catalog that lists over 50 different classes. My own training repertoire includes a course on preparing and delivering performance reviews, conducting productive meetings, introduction to Intel. Make a list of the things that you feel your subordinates or your members of your department should be trained in. Don't limit the scope of your list. Items should range from what seems simple, like training the person who takes calls, to loftier and more general things like the objectives and value systems of your department, your plant, your company. Developing a course, set a schedule, teach the course to the most knowledgeable of your subordinates who won't be confused by it, so they can help you perfect it through interaction and critique. If this is the first time teaching, you'll discover a few interesting things. Training is hard work. Even if you've been doing your job for a long time, you'll be amazed at how much you don't know. Don't be discouraged, this is typical. Much deeper knowledge of a task is required to teach that task than to simply do it. If you don't believe me, try explaining to someone over the phone how to drive a stick-shift car. Guess who will have learned the most from the course? You! The crispness that developing it will give you an understanding of your own work is likely to itself have made the effort extremely worthwhile. And you'll find that when the training process goes well, it is nothing short of exhilarating. And even this exhilaration is dwarfed by the warm feeling you'll get when you see a subordinate practice something you've taught him. The relish, the exhilaration and warmth, it will help you to arm yourself for tackling the second course. Oh my god. Just reading this makes me feel like I should be training myself. I should be, evaluating my processes. I should be challenging myself. I should be finding people that I interface with and seeing how that can be better. We can all do more. We can all be more. And Andy Grove, he has this infectious teacher energy and this nourishing, supporting guy energy. And it's all very procedural. It's very intelligent. And I'm probably going to read the book again. As I revisit it, I find that there's a lot of stuff that I don't remember the specifics of. And the last time I read it, I think I was still employed, 2 years ago probably. Or I might have read it sometime after that when I was focused on writing. But now that I think about it, there's so much that has changed for me in the past year or so. And I definitely want to upgrade all my shit, right? And yeah, so I highly recommend Andy Grove's High Output Management. I will say that if you don't have any background, and if if you're like a student potentially, it may seem a bit dry. I do remember when I first started reading it, I didn't enjoy it. It's not super fun. I think it very much expects you to be able to kind of see the parallels between the breakfast factory that he describes and whatever your own factory is. At some point he talks about if you have a long process it's good to try and have some kind of cut out a window in the middle somewhere where you can investigate to see how things are going, so that if things are going bad, like, you find out earlier than at the end, right? And just there's so many things like that. It's just so smart and so kind, I guess. Like, I mean, you know, it just, and so Andy Grove, I think he passed away a couple of years ago ish, and everyone who knew him seemed to speak very highly of him. And yeah, it's a good book. I recommend it. Look it up and let me know what you think. Let me know what your favorite quotes are. Done.